In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where perfectly trimmed lawns and white picket fences were the norm, Jack lived a simple life. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. Instead, he preferred staying in the background, tending to his garden on weekends and spending evenings tinkering with gadgets in his garage. His house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by trees that gave it a cozy, almost secluded feel. It was peaceful, until recently. Jack had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, lured by its charm and the promise of a tight-knit community governed by the Homeowners Association, HOA. At first, everything seemed perfect. The streets were clean, the neighbors friendly enough, and the rules designed to keep things orderly. But as time went on, Jack began noticing cracks in the idyllic facade. One neighbor, in particular, stood out: Karen. Karen was hard to miss. She drove a shiny Tesla Model 3, which she parked proudly in her driveway every evening. Her car gleamed under the streetlights, a symbol of her commitment to saving the planet, as she often reminded everyone. Karen fancied herself the unofficial leader of the HOA, always quick to point out when someone's mailbox leaned too far to the left or when a lawn needed mowing. To Jack, she came across more like a drill sergeant than a concerned neighbor. Despite her quirks, Jack didn't have much interaction with Karen. That changed one crisp autumn morning when he opened his latest electricity bill. His jaw dropped. The number was nearly double what he usually paid. Confused, Jack scoured his house for an explanation. Had he left a light on all night? Was his old refrigerator finally giving up? Nothing seemed out of place. It wasn't until later that week, while taking out the trash late one evening, that Jack stumbled upon a clue. There, in the dim glow of the porch light, he saw something shocking. Karen's Tesla plugged into his outdoor outlet. The cord snaked from her car across the narrow strip of grass separating their properties, disappearing into the wall of his home. For a moment, Jack just stared, unable to process what he was seeing. The next day, he approached Karen casually, trying not to sound accusatory. "Hey, I noticed your car was plugged into my outlet last night," he said, forcing a smile. "Everything okay?" Karen barely looked up from her phone. "Oh yeah," she replied dismissively. "I figured since you weren't using it, no harm done. Besides, we're all part of the same HOA. Sharing is caring, right?" Jack blinked, taken aback by her nonchalant attitude. "But that's my electricity," he pointed out. "You can't just use it without asking." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Relax, it's not like you're running a power plant over there. What's the big deal?" Jack walked away feeling frustrated but unsure of what to do. Confronting Karen directly hadn't worked, and he hated the idea of causing a scene. Still, the image of her Tesla draining his wallet gnawed at him. Little did he know, this small act of entitlement would spiral into something far bigger and spark a chain reaction neither of them could have predicted. As days turned into weeks, Jack found himself growing increasingly uneasy. The sight of Karen's Tesla plugged into his outlet became a regular occurrence, almost like clockwork. Every evening, without fail, she would park her car near his house and casually hook it up to his electricity supply. At first, Jack tried convincing himself that maybe this was just a temporary situation, a favor she assumed he wouldn't mind. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't about convenience, it was about entitlement. Karen's behavior gnawed at him. It wasn't just the fact that she was using his electricity. It was the way she acted as if it were her right. She never asked for permission, never offered to reimburse him, and worst of all, never showed even a hint of gratitude. Instead, whenever Jack brought it up, she brushed him off with vague comments about community spirit or how charging her Tesla helped reduce her carbon footprint. "Think of it as your contribution to saving the planet," she once quipped with a smirk, leaving Jack speechless. The more Jack thought about it, the angrier he became. He started paying closer attention to Karen's habits. On some nights, he'd peek through the curtains to see her casually strolling over with the charging cable in hand, acting as though she owned the place. Other times, he'd catch her chatting with other neighbors while her car silently siphoned power from his home. Each time, it felt like a personal insult, a slap in the face disguised as neighborly goodwill. Determined to resolve the issue, Jack decided to take a more formal approach. He reached out to the HOA board, hoping they could mediate the situation. After all, there had to be rules against something like this, right? Surely, the very organization Karen loved so much would side with common sense over her antics. Jack prepared carefully, gathering evidence. Photos of her car plugged into his outlet, copies of his inflated electricity bills, and even notes detailing each instance he'd noticed her doing it. When the day of the meeting arrived, Jack walked into the community center feeling hopeful. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who usually nodded politely but kept their distance. Karen sat front and center, already dominating the conversation before Jack could even open his mouth. When it was his turn to speak, he laid out his case calmly and logically, presenting his evidence and explaining how Karen's actions were unfair. But things didn't go as planned. Karen quickly took control of the narrative, spinning the story to make herself look like the victim. "Jack is being unreasonable," she declared, her voice dripping with Fox concern. "He's making a mountain out of a molehill. I'm simply trying to live sustainably, and he's refusing to support that." Her words struck a chord with some members of the board, who nodded sympathetically. Others chimed in, questioning why Jack couldn't just let it slide. "It's not like you're struggling financially," one neighbor remarked. Another added, "We're supposed to help each other here. Isn't that what being part of a community means?" Jack listened in disbelief as the discussion shifted away from fairness and toward accusations of selfishness. By the end of the meeting, no resolution had been reached, and Jack left feeling more frustrated than ever. Back at home, Jack replayed the events in his mind. How had Karen managed to twist the truth so effortlessly? Why did everyone seem blind to her blatant disregard for boundaries? As he stared at the outdoor outlet glowing faintly in the twilight, an idea began forming in his head, one that might finally put an end to this nonsense. Whatever happened next, Jack vowed, Karen would learn a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. Weeks stretched into months, and Karen's behavior only grew worse. If anything, her confidence soared after the failed HOA meeting. Emboldened by the lack of consequences, she began treating Jack's outlet as her personal charging station. What started as an occasional annoyance turned into a nightly ritual. Her Tesla gleamed under the dim streetlights, plugged neatly into his wall like it belonged there. To make matters worse, Karen no longer bothered to hide what she was doing. She'd stroll over casually, sometimes even chatting with other neighbors while her car silently drained electricity from Jack's home. Jack, on the other hand, felt trapped. The HOA had dismissed his concerns, and now whispers about him being difficult spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when they passed him on the sidewalk, while others openly criticized him for making such a fuss over something so small. But to Jack, it wasn't small at all. It was about principle, about standing up for himself when no one else seemed willing to listen. The breaking point came one particularly cold winter evening. Jack sat in his living room, sipping a cup of tea and trying to relax after a long day. Outside, the wind howled softly, rattling the windows. Just as he was about to turn off the lights and head to bed, he noticed a flicker of movement through the blinds. Peering outside, he saw Karen once again plugging her Tesla into his outlet. This time, however, she didn't just leave it running. She stood there smugly, scrolling through her phone as if mocking him from afar. Something inside Jack snapped. He realized that reasoning with Karen or appealing to the HOA wasn't going to work. She thrived on bending rules and manipulating situations to suit her needs. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could someone act so entitled? Why should he have to tolerate this blatant disrespect simply because she believed she was above reproach? That night, sleep eluded Jack. His mind raced with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. At first, he considered simpler solutions, locking the outlet cover, unplugging her car whenever he caught her, or even installing a security camera to catch her red-handed. But none of these ideas felt satisfying enough. They were temporary fixes at best, and knowing Karen, she'd find a way around them eventually. Then, inspiration struck. Jack remembered his college days when he studied electrical engineering. Though he hadn't worked in the field professionally, he still enjoyed tinkering with gadgets in his spare time. A spark of creativity ignited within him, an idea that might finally put an end to Karen's freeloading ways. The next morning, Jack headed straight to his garage. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with tools, wires, and half-finished projects. He rummaged through boxes until he found exactly what he needed: circuit components, a voltage regulator, and a few other odds and ends. With everything laid out before him, he began sketching designs on a notepad, mapping out a plan step by step. His goal was clear but calculated. He wanted to teach Karen a lesson, not harm her, but give her a taste of her own medicine. After hours of brainstorming, he settled on a clever solution: modifying the circuit connected to his outdoor outlet. The modification would deliver a harmless yet startling jolt to anyone attempting to use the outlet without permission. It wouldn't be dangerous, just enough to send a message loud and clear. As Jack worked tirelessly in his garage, piecing together the makeshift device, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. Would it work? Would Karen finally get the hint? He tested the system repeatedly, ensuring it functioned exactly as intended. By the time he finished, he felt confident that his plan was foolproof. Little did Karen know, her days of exploiting Jack's generosity were numbered. The quiet man she underestimated was about to turn the tables. And this time, she wouldn't see it coming. Life in the cul-de-sac eventually returned to its peaceful rhythm, though it was a different kind of peace than before. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer somehow, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. For years, Karen's domineering presence had cast a shadow over the community, stifling open conversations and breeding resentment. But now, with her influence diminished, people began to interact more genuinely. Smiles replaced forced pleasantries, and laughter echoed through the streets once again. Karen, for her part, retreated into a quieter existence. She still attended HOA meetings, but her contributions were minimal, limited to terse nods or occasional murmurs of agreement. Gone were the days when she dominated discussions or dictated how others should maintain their properties. Instead, she kept to herself, tending to her garden and occasionally posting updates on social media about her eco-friendly lifestyle. Her posts, however, lacked their previous smugness. Whether intentional or not, they came across as attempts to rebuild her tarnished reputation. Jack, meanwhile, resumed his low-key life, content to stay out of the spotlight. Neighbors who had once viewed him as aloof now saw him in a new light, as someone willing to stand up for himself while maintaining his integrity. Some even sought his advice on minor repairs or electrical projects, impressed by his resourcefulness. Jack didn't mind the attention. He enjoyed helping others, so long as it didn't disrupt his routine. One sunny afternoon, as Jack worked in his garage, a neighbor stopped by to thank him for what he'd done. "You really gave us all a wake-up call," the man said, leaning against the doorway. Karen had everyone walking on eggshells for years. Now, it feels like we can breathe again. Jack chuckled softly, wiping grease from his hands. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he replied. "I just wanted her to stop using my electricity without asking. Everything else, well, that's on her." The neighbor nodded knowingly. "Still, you handled it brilliantly. I don't think anyone will forget that anytime soon." Indeed, the memory of Outlet Karen lingered in the neighborhood lore, often brought up during casual chats or friendly jokes. At summer barbecues and holiday gatherings, stories of the shocking incident resurfaced, always met with laughter. Even Karen herself became a reluctant punchline at times, though most residents avoided mentioning her name directly around her. They didn't want to provoke another confrontation. It was enough that she had learned her lesson. As months passed, Karen made subtle efforts to reintegrate herself into the community. She baked cookies for a block party, volunteered to organize decorations for the annual Christmas lights display, and even complimented a neighbor's landscaping, a rare gesture of goodwill. While some dismissed these actions as insincere, others appreciated the attempt, seeing it as proof that she was trying to change. For Jack, the transformation in Karen was both surprising and satisfying. He never expected her to completely reform, nor did he care whether she did. What mattered was that balance had been restored, not just in his own life, but in the neighborhood as a whole. People no longer tiptoed around her or feared her wrath. Conversations flowed more naturally, disagreements were resolved amicably, and the sense of unity grew stronger. On quiet evenings, Jack would sit on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. Children played tag in the cul-de-sac, dogs barked in the distance, and neighbors exchanged greetings as they strolled past. It was a scene of simple happiness, one that reminded him why he had chosen this neighborhood in the first place. Every now and then, his gaze would drift toward Karen's house, where her Tesla sat proudly in the driveway, plugged into her shiny new Charger. A small smile would tug at the corners of his lips as he remembered the night sparks flew, literally and figuratively. Justice, unconventional as it had been, had prevailed, and in its wake, a stronger, fairer community had emerged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. And sometimes, that was all anyone could ask for. The fallout from the shocking incident rippled through the neighborhood for days. Karen, who had always prided herself on being the picture of perfection, found herself at the center of unwanted attention. The videos circulating online painted her in an unflattering light, with captions like "Entitled Tesla owner gets what she deserves," and "When free electricity backfires." Even local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing her Outlet Karen, much to her horror. At first, Karen tried to fight back. She posted lengthy rants on social media, claiming she was the victim of sabotage and accusing Jack of malicious intent. "This isn't just about me charging my car. It's about bullying and harassment," she wrote in a Facebook post that quickly gained traction. But instead of garnering sympathy, her dramatic tone only fueled more mockery. Commenters flooded her page with sarcastic remarks. "Maybe don't steal electricity next time," and "Sounds like karma's got your number." Meanwhile, the HOA board faced mounting pressure to address the situation. While some members still sympathized with Karen, others couldn't ignore the growing sentiment among residents that her behavior had been out of line. During a tense meeting, the board reviewed the inspector's report, which confirmed there was no evidence of tampering or deliberate harm caused by Jack. The outlet, they concluded, appeared to be functioning normally, albeit with minor wear and tear that might explain the shock. Frustrated but cornered, Karen shifted tactics. Instead of doubling down on accusations against Jack, she attempted to reframe herself as the real victim. At the next HOA gathering, she delivered a tearful speech about how stressful it was to live in such a judgmental community. "I've always tried to do what's best for everyone here," she sniffled, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But now I feel attacked, isolated, and unfairly judged." Her performance didn't land the way she hoped. Many neighbors exchanged skeptical glances, unconvinced by her theatrics. One resident finally spoke up, voicing what others had been thinking. "Karen, we're not saying you deserve to get shocked, but let's be honest, you were using Jack's electricity without permission. That's not okay, no matter how you spin it." The room fell silent after that remark. For once, Karen had no comeback. Her usual bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. It was clear to everyone present that she had overplayed her hand, and paid the price for it. In the weeks that followed, Karen began to retreat from her role as the neighborhood enforcer. She stopped policing other people's lawns and mailboxes, focusing instead on damage control for her reputation. She even went so far as to install her own level 2 charger in her driveway, posting photos of it on social media with captions like, "Going green" and "self-sufficient." Though her posts were clearly meant to project confidence, they came across as desperate attempts to save face. For Jack, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible after becoming an internet sensation. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now greeted him warmly, praising his ingenuity and quiet determination. Some even admitted they'd secretly cheered when Karen got her comeuppance. "You showed her, Jack," one elderly neighbor said with a wink during a chance encounter at the mailbox. About time someone stood up to her. Despite the support, Jack remained humble. He avoided gloating or rubbing salt in Karen's wounds, choosing instead to focus on moving forward. Still, he couldn't deny feeling a sense of vindication. After months of frustration and dismissal, he had finally been heard, and justice, albeit unconventional, had prevailed. As spring approached, the cul-de-sac seemed lighter somehow. The tension that had lingered for so long began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of balance. Conversations between neighbors grew friendlier, laughter echoed through the streets, and the once dreaded HOA meetings felt less oppressive. Even Karen, though humbled, seemed to soften around the edges, keeping mostly to herself and avoiding any further drama. Through it all, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought a simple outdoor outlet could spark such chaos? Yet, in its own strange way, the ordeal had brought the neighborhood closer together, not by fostering harmony, but by exposing the cracks beneath the surface and forcing everyone to confront them head-on. The HOA board's decision came as a surprise to no one, or at least, not to anyone except Karen. After weeks of deliberation, meetings, and whispered conversations among neighbors, the verdict was finally announced. Karen would be fined for violating community guidelines. Specifically, she was penalized for using another resident's utilities without permission, a rule buried deep in the HOA handbook that no one had bothered to enforce until now. To add insult to injury, she was also ordered to reimburse Jack for the excess electricity charges accrued during her months-long habit of siphoning power from his outlet. Karen didn't take the ruling well. At the next HOA meeting, she stormed into the community center like a hurricane, her face flushed with indignation. "This is outrageous," she shouted, slamming her palms on the table. "You're punishing me for something that wasn't even my fault. That outlet was faulty. It could have hurt anyone." Her dramatic outburst only made matters worse. The room erupted in murmurs, some sympathetic but most laced with disbelief. One neighbor leaned over to another and muttered under their breath, "She still doesn't get it." Even the HOA president, usually diplomatic to a fault, seemed exasperated. "Karen," he said firmly, "the inspectors found nothing wrong with the outlet. And regardless, you admitted to using Jack's electricity without asking. That's against the rules." Defeated but unwilling to concede, Karen sank into her chair, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her silence spoke volumes. She knew she'd lost this battle. But while the fine and reimbursement stung, the real blow came from the shift in public perception. Once admired, or at least tolerated, for her assertiveness, Karen was now seen as petty and entitled. The nickname Outlet Karen stuck, becoming a running joke among neighbors who once feared crossing her. For Jack, the resolution brought a mix of relief and vindication. He hadn't asked for recognition or applause. All he wanted was fairness. Now, with the issue officially resolved, he hoped to put the entire saga behind him. Still, he couldn't deny feeling a small sense of satisfaction, knowing that Karen had been held accountable, for once. As news of the HOA's decision spread, the neighborhood dynamic began to shift. People who had previously tiptoed around Karen now felt emboldened to stand up to her. When she complained about a neighbor's unkempt lawn, they shrugged her off. When she tried to micromanage the annual block party planning, Others politely reminded her that teamwork mattered more than perfection. Slowly but surely, Karen's grip on the neighborhood loosened. Even Karen herself underwent a noticeable change. Gone was the confident strut and sharp tongue that had defined her presence for years. Instead, she kept mostly to herself, avoiding eye contact during walks and dodging conversations at the mailbox. Some might have felt sorry for her if not for the fact that she had brought this upon herself. It was as though the shock from Jack's outlet had jolted her out of her self-appointed role as Queen Bee and forced her to confront the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, Jack returned to his quiet life, relieved to have closure. He removed the modified circuit from his outdoor outlet, restoring it to its original state. There was no need for tricks anymore. Karen wasn't going to come near his property anytime soon. In fact, she seemed determined to avoid him altogether, which suited Jack just fine. Life in the cul-de-sac settled into a new rhythm. Neighbors who had once walked on eggshells around Karen now interacted more freely, sharing laughs and organizing gatherings without fear of judgment. The tension that had lingered for so long dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie. Even the HOA meetings became less tense, with discussions focusing on practical matters rather than Karen's endless list of grievances. Looking back, Jack realized how much the ordeal had changed things, not just for him, but for everyone. While he hadn't set out to teach Karen a lesson, his clever solution had inadvertently sparked a chain reaction. It exposed cracks in the neighborhood's foundation, forcing people to address unresolved frustrations and reevaluate their relationships with one another. And in doing so, it paved the way for a healthier, more balanced community. Still, whenever Jack passed Karen's driveway and saw her Tesla plugged neatly into her brand-new Charger, he couldn't help but smile. Justice, he thought, had a funny way of working itself out. The shock from the outlet sent ripples through the neighborhood, both literally and figuratively. Within minutes, curious neighbors gathered outside Jack's house, their faces illuminated by the glow of porch lights and phone screens. Some looked concerned, while others wore expressions of barely concealed amusement. Karen stood in the middle of it all, her Tesla parked awkwardly nearby, the charging cable lying abandoned on the ground like evidence at a crime scene. "What happened?" one neighbor asked, glancing between Karen and Jack. "She rigged this," Karen spat, pointing dramatically at Jack. "He did something to the outlet. It shocked me." Jack raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Rigged it? I don't know what you're talking about. I came out here because I heard a noise, just like everyone else." Karen's face turned redder with each word. "Don't act innocent. You knew exactly what you were doing." By now, a small crowd had formed, a mix of nosy neighbors and teenagers filming the spectacle on their phones. Someone muttered, "This is wild," while another whispered, "Did she really get shocked?" Jack kept his composure, speaking calmly but firmly. "Look, maybe there's a wiring issue. These things happen. I'll call an electrician tomorrow to check it out. But honestly, Karen, why are you using my outlet in the first place? That's not really fair, is it?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. A few people shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Others exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging that Karen's behavior had been questionable for a long time. Jack's words struck a nerve, not just with Karen, but with those who had quietly resented her actions. Karen, realizing she was losing ground, doubled down. "It's not about the outlet. This is sabotage. You deliberately set this up to humiliate me." Her voice rose shrilly, drawing more attention than ever before. One older neighbor chimed in, clearly annoyed. "Honestly, Karen, if you've been using his electricity without asking, that's kind of shady too, isn't it?" Another added, "Yeah, it's not like you can just take someone else's power whenever you feel like it." For once, Karen was speechless. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her confidence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. The same woman who had dominated HOA meetings and bossed around her neighbors, now found herself on the defensive, surrounded by murmurs of disapproval. As the crowd dispersed, Jack retreated back inside his house, leaving Karen fuming in the cold night air. He could hear her muttering under her breath as she stormed off toward her home, dragging the charging cable behind her like a defeated soldier carrying a broken weapon. The next morning, whispers spread faster than wildfire. Video clips of the incident began circulating online, showing Karen jumping back from the outlet and shouting accusations at Jack. Social media exploded with reactions, turning the quiet cul-de-sac into an unexpected internet sensation. Memes popped up overnight, poking fun at Karen's antics. One viral post featured a picture of her Tesla with the caption, "When your eco-friendly lifestyle depends on stealing electricity." Despite the growing ridicule, Karen refused to back down. Instead, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA, accusing Jack of tampering with his property to intentionally harm her. Inspectors arrived days later to assess the situation, coming over Jack's outdoor outlet with flashlights and multimeters. They poked, prodded, and tested every inch of the wiring, but found nothing unusual. To them, it appeared to be a perfectly standard outlet, albeit one that might need minor maintenance. When questioned, Jack maintained his innocence. "I have no idea why it shocked her," he said earnestly. "Maybe it was a fluke. Either way, I hope she learns to respect boundaries moving forward." With no concrete evidence against him, the inspectors concluded their investigation, leaving Karen empty-handed. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. While some still sided with Karen, many began to see her in a new light, not as the self-appointed leader of the HOA, but as someone who had crossed a line and gotten burned, figuratively speaking. For Jack, the ordeal marked a turning point. He hadn't intended to become the center of attention, but his clever solution had exposed Karen's hypocrisy and earned him a surprising amount of support from his neighbors. As life slowly returned to normal, one thing was clear: Karen would think twice before taking anything for granted ever again. Jack spent the next several days fine-tuning his invention, pouring all of his focus into making sure it was both effective and safe. The garage became his sanctuary, a place where he could channel his frustration into something productive. Tools were scattered across the workbench, wires snaked around like tangled vines, and diagrams covered the walls. He worked late into the night, fueled by determination and cups of strong coffee. This wasn't just about teaching Karen a lesson anymore. It was about reclaiming control over his own space. The device he created was simple yet ingenious. It involved rewiring the outdoor outlet to include a custom-built circuit that would deliver a mild but startling electric shock if someone attempted to use it without authorization. The jolt wouldn't be dangerous, nothing more than an unpleasant surprise, but it would certainly get Karen's attention. Jack tested the system repeatedly, adjusting the voltage until he was confident it posed no real risk of injury. Safety was important to him. This wasn't about revenge or causing harm. It was about sending a clear message: you don't take what isn't yours. With the modifications complete, Jack took a step back to admire his handiwork. The outlet looked completely normal from the outside, its secrets hidden behind layers of insulation and carefully concealed wiring. Anyone who didn't know better would never suspect a thing. Satisfied with his efforts, Jack cleaned up the garage and prepared for the inevitable showdown. Now came the hardest part: waiting. Each evening, Jack kept a close watch on his property, peeking through the blinds every so often to see if Karen would make her move. His heart raced with anticipation, a strange mix of nerves and excitement bubbling inside him. Would she fall for it? Would she finally understand the consequences of her actions, or would she find some way to wiggle out of it, as she always seemed to do? Finally, the moment arrived. One chilly night, as Jack sat in his living room flipping through channels on the TV, he noticed movement outside. Through the window, he saw Karen approaching his house, her Tesla parked neatly nearby. In one hand, she carried the charging cable, and in the other, her phone, glowing faintly as she scrolled through social media. She moved with the same casual arrogance she always did, as though the world revolved around her convenience. Jack's pulse quickened. He watched silently as Karen reached the outlet and bent down to plug in the cord. For a split second, everything seemed normal. The hum of the neighborhood, the distant bark of a dog, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, without warning, there was a loud crackle, followed by a flash of light. Karen yelped, jumping backward as sparks flew from the connection. The cord slipped from her grasp, landing on the ground with a thud. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at the outlet in disbelief. Her face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, Jack couldn't tell. But then, almost immediately, she began shouting, her voice cutting through the quiet night like a knife. "What is this? What did you do?" she screamed, pointing accusingly at Jack's house. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to react. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, undone by a harmless prank. But instead, he forced himself to remain calm. Taking a deep breath, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. His expression was neutral, almost concerned, as he approached her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone careful and measured. "I heard a noise and came to check. Did something happen?" Karen glared at him, her hands trembling slightly. "Don't play dumb with me. You rigged this outlet, didn't you? This is your fault." Jack raised his hands in mock innocence. "Rigged it? I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe there's a problem with the wiring. We should probably call an electrician to take a look." Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some looked worried, others amused, but all were curious. Karen stumbled over her words, trying to explain what had happened, but her story sounded increasingly ridiculous. Jack stood quietly, letting her dig herself deeper into her own hole. By the time the crowd dispersed, Karen's face was beet red, and her confidence had taken a noticeable hit. As Jack returned to his house, he couldn't suppress a small smile. The plan had worked perfectly. Karen had gotten exactly what she deserved, and now, the neighborhood gossip mill would have plenty to talk about.